All right. On today's show, we have Dr. Robert Zubrin. Dr. Zubrin is the founder and president of the Mars Society, which you can visit at marssociety.org. He's author of many books, including The Case for Mars, The Plan to Settle the Red Planet, and Why We Must. The link to the book will be in the description below. Dr. Zubrin, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. So I guess my first question for you is, what exactly is the Mars Society?
Mars Society is an international organization of people wanting to help further the human and robotic exploration of Mars and the settlement of Mars using both public and private means, any way it can be done.
That's incredible. Dr. Zubrin, how did you end up founding such a lofty goal?
Well, I'm an astronautical engineer, and in the 1989-90 period, I worked out a plan for enabling human Mars missions in our time using present-day technology. And eventually it had an impact, and NASA embraced it for a while, and they realized it was going to cut the cost of a human Mars exploration program by about an order of magnitude. Newsweek heard about it, published a story about it. On the 25th anniversary of the moon landing. We're now approaching the 50th anniversary. But a literary agent heard about that. She called me up. You should write a book. I wrote a book. It was called The Case for Mars. It was published in 96. It was very successful. I got 4,000 letters from all kinds of people from all over the world, and they said all kinds of things. But underneath what everyone was saying was simply this, a question: how do we make this happen? And I looked at that and I said, if we could pull this amount of talent together, we can make it happen, or we'd at least have a force to try. And so I and some close friends who think the way I do called the founding convention of the Mars Society in Boulder in 1998. 700 people showed up. And by the end of the conference, we had 25 chapters across the world, and now we have more like 70. That's how it all got started. And we decided we'd do three things. One, just general outreach to spread the vision. Second, political work to defend the various Mars programs that were, embattled in the political arena. And the third being projects of our own, of which the most important have been the setting up of these two Mars exploration stations in the Canadian Arctic and the American desert, where people can do practice Mars missions and try to figure out what's going to work on Mars.
That's awesome. I also saw on your website that you're holding a bit of a contest to see who can come up with the best ideas for the first human settlement on Mars. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, a donor donated some $20,000 to be used as prizes for a competition to design a Mars colony. And by design a Mars colony for 1,000 people, and 40% of it is of the points are for technical design. 30% are for economics. How's this thing going to sustain itself economically? And then the other 10 each are for social forms, political forms, and aesthetics.
That's incredible. So I guess the question that looms...
And the first prize is $10,000, and then there's some other prizes with the remaining 10.
Yeah, I saw that. That was incredible. I guess the question that looms over everyone's head when we talk about settling on Mars is the why. And I was hoping that maybe you can help us understand, why should we go to Mars?
Well, why have children?
That's a good point.
Really.
Fair enough.
What we're talking about here is creating a new branch of human civilization. And why is that useful? Benjamin Franklin. He was over in France during the American Revolution as our ambassador, but of course he was also an experimenter with electricity, and he was doing all these tricks with electricity in front of audiences of French aristocrats. And one nobleman came up to him at the end of one of his demonstrations, and he said, "But Dr. Franklin, this is all very amusing, but of what possible use could electricity ever be?" And Franklin's answer was, "Of what use is a baby?"
That's incredible. That's a really interesting way to put it. I guess maybe more specifically, a lot of folks posit, going into space is obviously the next step for our species. So ideas have been posited for, International Space Station, the moon, and of course, you're putting forth the idea for Mars. What makes Mars the best possible candidate for
Well,
setting up a human colony?
Well, Mars is the closest planet that has in plenitude all the resources necessary to support life and therefore civilization. There may be small amounts of water frozen in permanently shadowed craters in the lunar polar regions, but elsewhere its water is only present in parts per million quantities in the soil. On Mars, there are continent-sized regions that are 60% water by weight in the soil, and there's even huge glaciers, including at latitudes as far south, for instance, as 38 degrees north, which is the same latitude as San Francisco on Earth. Giant glaciers with a pure water ice, as much as in the Great Lakes of the United States. And so there's water on Mars. There's carbon on Mars. The atmosphere is carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide and water is what you need to grow plants. There's nitrogen on Mars. Nitrogen's a key minority element needed for biology. So there you have the basis of biology and of synthetic chemistry and of a lot of industrial chemistry. Because the other thing you have a lot of on Mars is iron oxide. That's why the planet is red. You can hit iron oxide with carbon monoxide, which you can make from carbon dioxide, and then you turn it into steel. That's how we make it on Earth. And you can do that on Mars. I mean, there's all this stuff. There's no carbon on the moon. And we're carbon-based life forms. We're made of carbon and water.
Right.
And, and everything we use, everything you eat is made of carbon and water. Everything you wear is made of carbon and water, and everything else is made with carbon and water. And so Mars has got the resources. I like to compare it to the moon as, for instance, North America compared to Greenland in the European age of exploration. Europeans reached Greenland first. It's closer to Europe, but is a much poorer environment. And it wasn't a place where you could set up some outposts there, but you couldn't set up a new civilization there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it sounds like for Mars at least, it's got a lot of the ingredients to help sustain human settlement. But clearly, there's still work to be done when we get there. What would we need to do to make Mars habitable for human beings?
Well, okay, making Mars habitable is going to take a while, but creating the basis for humans to live on Mars can be done fairly rapidly. Okay, I mean, the first humans to land on Mars will probably use their spaceships as their houses. They'll wear spacesuits when they go outside, and they'll use both pressurized and unpressurized vehicles. That is, they'll have vehicles like all-terrain vehicles that you have to wear your spacesuit when you're riding around on, but they're still quite useful because they give you a nice informal relationship with the environment. And then there'll be pressurized vehicles, like more or less think of things like an SUV that you ride around inside of, and you don't have to wear a spacesuit, but you put one on when you want to go outside. Or even bigger things, the size of buses. But I tend to like smaller vehicles because, there's no roads and there's no AAA on Mars. So better with a nimble vehicle. Better a Jeep than a bus, and better an all-terrain vehicle than a Jeep.
Definitely.
But so that's what we'll do. But then we can create underground vaults on Mars, and they can actually be under the dirt or even carved into ice. Ice is very strong on Mars because it's cold, and you could create underground ice caves and just line them with insulator and create, habitation volumes comparable to that in like major subway systems, where you just underground malls, as it were, and then we'll set up domes on the surface. And then which will give us, habitable domes, and each one maybe 100 yards in diameter, but linked together by tunnels, so you can go from one to the other. You can grow plants in these things lit by sunlight. Now, in terms of actually transforming Mars, that's called terraforming. Now, that's a big project.
Right.
And now the way to do it is to do a little global warming. We know how to do that. And,
we do it pretty well here, huh?
Yeah, well, okay, we're going to have to improve our abilities in that respect. But yes, we do know that you can put gases in an atmosphere that increases its heat trapping capability. And in fact, there are much more powerful greenhouse gases than CO2. For instance, CF4, carbon tetrafluoride, which is a refrigerant used on Earth, is thousands of times more powerful greenhouse agent than CO2, molecule for molecule. And if we set up factories to produce that on Mars and put it into the atmosphere instead of refrigerators, and we did it on the same scale that we produce those kinds of chemicals on Earth, in 50 years, you'd warm Mars by 10 centigrade. Now, that's a lot. Okay, that's 10 times as much as anybody is thinking that, well, okay, there are people who think we're going to do all sorts of things, but that's 10 times as much as the global warming that has been since 1880. Okay.
Oh, wow. That's huge.
And that is such a strong warming that it would force carbon dioxide, which has been soaked into the soil, to outgas and thicken the atmosphere. And CO2 is also a greenhouse gas, as you know, and that would warm it even more. So then in a couple of centuries, you warm Mars 50 centigrade. You warm Mars 50 centigrade, then, I mean, Mars will be almost as warm as Earth, and certainly the tropics on Mars will be just fine as far as temperature is concerned, and even mid-latitudes would be pretty good. And then all this ice, or not all, but a lot of it, and firm permafrost would start to melt and it'd start flowing, and you'd have liquid water on Mars. You'd have lakes, you'd have rivers. There's dried up lakes and rivers on Mars now because all the water is frozen, but there are streams of Mars that flow again, and there'd be rain, and you could start spreading plants around on the surface with a thick CO2 atmosphere, adequate warmth, liquid water. And the plants would eventually they would green the planet, and they'd also put oxygen in its atmosphere.
Right.
Now, if you talk about the kind of plants we actually have now, they'd take 1,000 years to put enough oxygen in Mars' atmosphere for you to breathe it. But if we're talking 200 years from now, it's hardly a stretch to think that we could genetically engineer plants to be much more efficient at photosynthesis, and we could do it a lot faster.
Introduce some super GMO plants to kind of accelerate that process. Yeah, that'd be interesting. So say we've done a lot of that. You know, we've got our habitats on Mars, right? Our domes and our all-terrain vehicles and things like that, and we're in the process of trying to terraform Mars. What other challenges are presented to the human body on Mars that we should know about?
Well, it's 1/3 gravity, so unless you exercise a fair amount, that could have negative effects on muscles, although undoubtedly not as much as zero gravity does.
Clearly, yeah.
There's a certain amount of space radiation on Mars, about the same as there is at the space station, but especially if you lived in these underground vaults, that wouldn't be an issue at all. It would all be shielded. And even on the surface habs, if you put sandbags on the roof of the hab, it would mask most of the radiation out. There's stuff like that. But I think, it's going to be challenging. And that's part of the charm. Challenge is good. People grow in their challenge. Civilizations grow in their challenge. There's a lot of people say America really developed this can-do attitude because of the frontier, which constantly presented new challenges, but also in a place where people were remote from old institutions that were trying to control the ways to do things. So let's just do it this way. And this is where you get the characteristic American ideology, which is pragmatism. Why do we have to do it that way just because it's been done that way?
Right.
This looks like a better way to do it. And the belief that there is always a better way. And I think the Martians will have that attitude in spades.
So with that being said, I do remember reading something about Mars dust and how it has potentially either radioactive or toxic, generally bad stuff in it. What would Mars dust present a serious challenge for anyone who went to the red planet?
No, it's not radioactive. Some of it may have perchlorates, which are chemical compounds that, you can see some of them in detergents and such. I mean, you'd want to wash out Martian soil before you use it to grow plants, and you want to keep the dust out of the building. Once it starts to rain on Mars, all that stuff will be destroyed.
Okay, I didn't know that. So restarting the water cycle will pretty much solve that issue.
Yep.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. So funny question. What happens if we get to Mars and, we're doing our thing and everything's going well and we discover, I don't know, some life forms on Mars? Like, do we have a plan to protect ourselves from them?
It's very unlikely that the life forms on Mars will be of any threat to the humans because you see, pathogens are specifically adapted to their hosts. This is why no one has ever caught Dutch elm disease,
Mm-hmm.
and treats don't catch the measles. The organisms that prey on us have been preying on our ancestors and engaged in an arms race with our ancestors for the past 4 billion years.
Right.
And, certain closely related species you could get a disease from, like dogs and rabies, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But dogs are very closely related to us, okay? Mammals. Okay, we don't get diseases from things like plants that we are not related to, and there is no macrofauna or flora on Mars.
Right.
So that's another point. Okay?
Yeah.
so there's no pathogens for anything on Mars because there
Mm-hmm.
can't be. And frankly, if there's any microorganisms on Mars, they're deep underground in the groundwater, which is because the Martian surface used to be habitable for microbes when the planet was warm and wet, but it became too cold, and so the only place that's habitable, by habitable I mean for microbes, is the groundwater on Mars. And there is
Mm-hmm.
groundwater on Mars, and that's where we have a good chance of finding microbes. But the original microbial inhabitants of the Earth can no longer live on the surface of the Earth. There's too much oxygen. They're down there in the groundwater, and no one's ever caught disease from one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were designed to have
To attack different
to live
things.
independent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they don't even attack anything. They were autotrophs. Some of them might eat each other, but they lived in a world there was only other microbes in it, and that's what they're used to. They never saw a person, they never saw a horse, they never saw a tree.
Yeah.
They're way down there underground, and they live on chemical energy.
So what do you think what's your best guess at the origin of those microbes that could exist in water on Mars? Do you think that that's like an indigenously created thing that conditions on Mars developed that type of life? Or
that's a very interesting
panspermia?
scientific question,
Mm-hmm.
which you can only answer by going and looking. There's
Sure.
a number of possibilities. Okay, first of all, all Earth life has a common origin, and we know it because they all use the same genetic alphabet,
Mm-hmm.
DNA and RNA.
Right.
Okay. Now, you can tell that the French language and the English language have a common origin because we use the same alphabet, and then we have a lot of words in common.
Correct.
Okay. The Chinese alphabet does not have a common origin with our alphabet. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So are the Martians using the Latin alphabet, or are they using Chinese? Okay. So that's the question. All right. If they have a common origin with us, they'll be using the same alphabet. If they have a separate origin, they would use a different alphabet because there's an infinite number of alphabets that you could create. Okay.
That's interesting.
All right. Now, what if they are using the same alphabet? Well, then there's still a very interesting question.
Right.
Did life on Mars come from Earth? Did life on Earth come from Mars? Or did they both come from someplace else?
And you're talking about panspermia, correct?
Yeah. Well, or at least transpermia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, see, there's a mystery about life on Earth, which is that we don't find any free living organisms simpler than bacteria. And bacteria are really very complicated. They've got the whole alphabet of genes. They have all sorts of complicated stuff going on. And to think that bacteria were the first organisms is like thinking the iPhone was the first machine. It's not possible.
Yeah, there's steps beforehand, right?
Right. So there's a whole technological history before the iPhone. There's computers, there's telephones, there's electricity, there's glass, there's steel, there's written words, and there's spoken language, all of which are technologies that are necessary for the iPhone. And
right.
Now, and if you landed on a planet where there were people with iPhones, but no evidence of any of those prior technologies, you would know they got them from foreigners.
Right. Right.
that they couldn't have developed it themselves. Now, so here's these bacteria on Earth. We don't see the predecessor technologies.
Mm-hmm.
So this is suggested to many researchers, although not everyone's convinced, that life on Earth is an immigrant phenomenon. Now, did it come from interstellar space or did it come from nearby? Well, if we go to Mars and find life that uses the same alphabet, but also simpler forms than anything we see on Earth,
it would suggest that it came from Mars, or at least it started earlier on Mars. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, that's what it would say. Now, okay, so if it's a different alphabet, then you have two separate origins, and that would suggest that both originated indigenously.
Right.
If you have the same alphabet, but we also see the simpler examples, like, in Africa, you find people, but you also find earlier primates. So we know that people came from Africa because the earlier examples of
other hominids, right?
Okay, so if we find microorganisms comparable to bacteria, but also more primitive varieties, then we would know that life on Earth and Mars both came from Mars. Okay, if we find the same kind of organisms, but no prior ancestors, it would suggest that both were seeded from interstellar space.
Interesting.
And finally, if we find no life at all on Mars, that would suggest that life on Earth is indigenous. Because if we were being seeded from interstellar space, it would have seeded Mars as well.
That is so interesting. So what do you think? Without knowing any of the answers, what do you think is the best guess?
My guess is that we both seeded from interstellar space. And the reason is it's like this. Okay. There's Brooklyn and there's Coney Island.
Right.
Okay.
I'm in Brooklyn now, so.
All right. So, did people come to Brooklyn from Coney Island? Did people come to Coney Island from Brooklyn? Or did people come to both of them from somewhere else? The odds, even without knowing about anthropology in Africa and all this, the odds would still be, since there's so much more something else, that neither of them are the first place, and both were seeded from the outside.
I see. So you're playing the statistical bet, right? You're saying there's a whole lot of universe out there.
Right. So there's 400 billion other solar systems in our galaxy.
Right.
What is the probability that we were the first? 1 in 400 billion.
Mm-hmm. And that's statistically very low.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. I like to think about these things all the time.
So that's another reason to go to Mars, aside from,
figure it out.
It is for the knowledge, to find out the truth about the purpose, not so much the purpose, but the place of life in the universe. Are we a unique phenomenon, or are we part of something much larger and much more varied?
Well, I certainly like that idea, the idea of exploration and figuring things out a lot better than the idea of we need to go to Mars because our planet's dying and we need to leave.
No, we're not going to Mars because our planet is dying. We're going to Mars not to escape the Earth, but to create another Earth, another partner. Together to Mars and then together with Mars.
I like that. I like the sound of that.
Yeah. No, I disagree entirely with people who say the reason to go to Mars is so there just be some survivors if the Earth is hit by an asteroid. I mean, that's ridiculous. Now, if we do go to Mars, we will have interplanetary spaceflight capabilities that will allow human civilization to deflect asteroids so that neither Mars nor Earth will be hit. Okay, that's a good idea. But the idea of trying to run away from Earth so that you could hide out on Mars, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's very escapist, very much so. Well, the one thing we hadn't talked about is like, how are we going to afford this? Like, how much would it cost us, conservatively speaking, to get to Mars and to set up habitats and to begin the process of terraforming? Like, who's going to pay for this?
Well, first of all, we do have a space program, and we funded at $20 billion a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we could have people on Mars in 10 years for $20 billion if it was done in a well-directed NASA program. That'd be 10% of NASA's budget.
Right.
But I think we can even do it cheaper than that because we have entrepreneurs now who are developing new space systems.
Correct.
On a time frame and at a cost, a third to a tenth what has become accepted in the aerospace industry.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Augustine Commission said the Bush moon program was impossible because it needed a heavy lift vehicle and it would cost $36 billion to develop. Elon Musk developed a heavy lift vehicle. It cost him $1 billion.
Right. That's 1/36 of the amount. And
Yeah.
he did it faster, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He did it in a fraction of the time and in a 30th of the cost. Exactly.
Yeah, that's incredible. I look up to Elon Musk for his kind of can-do attitude, and basically he says, "I'm going to make rocket ships," and people tell him, "Well, you can't do that," and he says, "Well, yes, I can," just because. I love that, and I was watching your talk from last August at the Mars Society conference, and you pointed out that Elon Musk, as high profile as he is, he's not the only one, and there will be many more. Can you talk to us a little bit about like the growing economy of privatized space industry?
Sure. Look, what Musk has done is not just develop a bunch of valuable space systems. He's done that. But he's proven a larger point. He's proven that it is possible for a well-led entrepreneurial organization to do things in a third the time at 1/10 the cost that it's become expected in the mainline aerospace government cost plus contracting aerospace industry,
Right.
and even do things that they had deemed impossible, like having launch vehicles that fly back to the launch pad instead of crashing into the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And so he and as a result, other people are getting into the game. Of course, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson,
Mm-hmm.
but there's going to be a lot more. There's going to be SpaceX in China. You can count on it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in Russia,
Mm-hmm.
Japan. There's also and there are also many SpaceXs like Rocket Labs, a company started in New Zealand, a country with virtually no space program. They're now launching small launch vehicles that they developed on private money. And Vector Space, founded by Jim Cantrell, who, by the way, is the guy that helped Musk start SpaceX. He then went off on his own. And he's just he's not a billionaire. He's a middle-class engineer, but he was able to get investment to start this company, and they'll be flying this year too. And so money is rushing into this, and not only into space, by the way. We're now seeing fusion power startups get funded.
I'm very excited about that. Yeah.
Yes, and yes. Because it's the same thing with space. A lot of people are realizing that things that were impossible were not for technical reasons, but institutional reasons.
Right. Organizational reasons. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I love fusion. I definitely want to talk about that at some point. But with all these extra players that'll spring up, and you say, without a doubt, my money's on China's definitely making some kind of SpaceX. Like entrepreneurs all over the world are going to start, sending privatized missions to space. And the big money there is, I guess, in satellites, right? So what is it, like you said, something like 100 satellites a year go up into space. Wouldn't that pose kind of a bit of an issue for like space junk, like space debris? Isn't that kind of a big issue already?
Well, space debris is an issue, and we have to make provision not to make it worse.
Mm-hmm.
Satellites, after they have used their time, have to either be deorbited or boosted into higher orbits, which are out of the way of anyone else. There's an awful lot of space out there,
Mm-hmm.
but anyway, it's just something that has to be dealt with. It's like the ocean. There's a certain amount of pollution going into the ocean, and we're going to have to pass appropriate regulations to limit that in order to keep the oceans viable. But it doesn't mean banning ships. It just making sure that ships aren't dumping their wastes into the ocean all over the place.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a fair balance between everything. Henry, I feel like I've co-opted the entire show. Do you have anything to add?
The main question I have is, what would the first mission look like? Would it be a one-way trip or would it be a round trip? Like, how would that work?
I believe the first mission will be a round trip. We want to go to Mars first to explore, and we'll probably want to explore a number of places. I mean, we're exploring already now with robots and satellites, but there's no comparison compared to what a human can do on the ground. And we're going to want to check out a number of places before we choose the place where we're going to put a colony. Okay, I mean, Elon Musk says that he'll start his colony by sending a bunch of starships there one way first, and now you've got like a bunch of apartment buildings on Mars. But wouldn't it be ridiculous to send them to the wrong place?
Yeah. So we need a real estate broker on Mars, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now, of course, and just like on Earth, real estate becomes much more valuable when certain other things are there. There's a lot of real estate in the Western United States. It's almost worthless. There's no roads to it. There's no tower lines. There's no water lines. Right. The first thing that started to make real estate valuable in the American West was, it's close to the railroad. You can ship your crops back east. Okay. And then, what if you're close to the city? And, look at New York, right? The most valuable real estate, perhaps in the world, certainly up there, Manhattan.
Sure.
Because it's right there where everybody wants to do business. Brooklyn, a little cheaper. Brooklyn became more valuable, though, once they built the Brooklyn Bridge.
That's right.
Because then it became much more possible to live in Brooklyn and commute into Manhattan, and so on. And right now, how can I sell you any place on Mars? Because any place is as good as any other. Pretty much.
Yeah.
Right? But once there's a colony there and somebody has a nuclear reactor, and now in this neighborhood you can get electricity, now that land's worth a lot more.
Right.
And how about if I put a dome up? Under that dome, there's air.
Right. You can breathe.
That's Manhattan real estate now.
Yeah.
Okay. So there you go. And developers, that's what they do. They buy land when it's worthless, and they put stuff on it to make it worth something.
Definitely. So what's your take on this Mars One hoax that fizzled out? I read recently that their company dissolved and that they have like less than $20,000 in the bank, and we were all just fooled into believing we were going to watch a reality TV show.
Well, first of all, I think that Mars One was never really serious about anything except trying to create a reality TV show. No, and now that was a business proposition, and they managed to get some investors around it. Here's a show, right? And it conceivably could make money, and so on. Now, of course, it was never realistic to assume that the amount of money a show could make, even if it had been successful, and conceivably it could have been a successful TV show.
I'd watch it.
Could have made the kind of money necessary to fund a human mission to Mars, let alone a colony on Mars. And that was a real problem. And I spoke to Bas Lonsdorff, and I said, look, this is ridiculous. The problem with your plan is not any specific engineering flaws. If you had money, you could hire engineers and you could fix those flaws. But
right.
the idea that the financial plan here is totally off the wall. And, and I offered him an alternative model. I said, look, here's the thing. There's 7 billion people on Earth. About 1 billion of them live in the advanced sector where people aren't worried about whether they're going to eat tonight and have disposable income. And at least 10% of those think that it's important that humans expand into space. So there's 100 million people. 100 million people times $100 a year would be $10 billion a year. That would be enough to finance the colonization of Mars. Right. And especially if it was done privately. what Mars doesn't need is a reality TV show. What that Mars needs is an international Mars settlement support organization, and there's models for that if you think about it. Because if you look at some of the most counterintuitive and bold colonization efforts there's been over the past 400 years, the Pilgrims going to Massachusetts, the Mormons going to Utah, the Jews going to Palestine, they were all backed by large home front organizations that were raising the money to sponsor the people who would actually go.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, this is even true with Israel to this day. And so, you know, if you actually, so what Mars needs is not a Bas Lansdorff, it needs a Theodore Herzl.
I see. Someone that can organize a bunch of people to support
an ideal, and an ideal basically that is being pursued not so much for a business reason, but for a transcendental reason, for a cause that goes beyond business.
Right.
Okay. And think of the Mormons. I mean, picking out Utah, what a ridiculous place to put a colony, given that so much more attractive places were available in California and Oregon and Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's exactly why they chose it. Is they wanted to have their own place.
Yeah.
And so there you go. That is what happened, and I think that could happen with Mars. But the Bas Lansdorff was not the person to do that. So now the problem with Mars One, once again, was not that it was a one-way mission. At some point, we will go to Mars one way, and it is true that going one way is, from a technical point of view, is easier than going round trip.
Right.
Half the hardware is unnecessary.
Right.
And also half the mission risk is not done. You don't have to risk the whole flight back. But I think that, properly speaking, certainly the wisest course would be to do exploration missions before settlement missions.
Sure.
But beyond that, I do disagree with people who said that the Mars one was, or a one-way mission to Mars is a suicide mission. We're all on a one-way trip somewhere, okay?
Yeah.
But it wasn't serious, okay? It just wasn't.
Henry, did you have anything else that you wanted to add or ask?
I have some bad sirens in the background, so I'm putting myself on mute.
Okay.
I do want to say one more thing about Mars One.
Sure. Fire off.
Okay. Despite the various negative things that I've just said, it actually did have a positive effect on a lot of people. They did get thousands and thousands of volunteers, many of whom then went off to study engineering so they could be part of this. I know some of those people, and they're actually very good people. So the many of the Mars One volunteers, and I would have to say, you know, they eventually did down select to a final 100, and I met some of those final 100, and many of those people would be fully qualified, certainly serious candidates for selection for the NASA Astronaut Corps. So they did mobilize a lot of good people, and other people who might not have been in the first tier for selection went and got themselves scientific educations because they were inspired by the challenge of going to Mars. So at the end of the day, I really can't hold it against them. You know, the fee was $30. Nobody got seriously hurt. And some people had something added to their lives.
Yeah, they had a bit of purpose. Yeah. That's awesome. So can we still do a reality TV show if we do end up going to Mars, when we do end up going to Mars? Because I was getting my hopes up for that, because I don't think I'll be one of the first people over, but I definitely want to watch.
Well, there definitely could be various kinds of TV shows about going to Mars. I'm still looking for a theatrical movie that is really right. You know, the best one we've had so far has been The Martian. But I have an issue with The Martian.
What was that?
And it's not because of a couple of technical nits that I have. It is because the character wasn't interested in Mars. Matt Damon just wanted to go home. He could have been home by staying home. Okay, he wasn't interested in the search for life on Mars and resolving this question of where did life come from. He wasn't interested in the new frontier on Mars. So while The Martian was a good movie, the great Mars movie has yet to be made. And I might say I've written a novel called First Landing that I think could be the basis for such a thing. But whether it's
We'll have to
mine or
read it
someone
then.
else's, there's a piece of art that needs to be done to really make the case for Mars in film. James
I'll have to read
Cameron, are you listening?
it. He's actually a listener. He listens to Bro History all the time, so he'll get the message, I think.
Okay, well, I think he could do it. We're going to need someone to rise to the challenge. Because I know he actually believes in this kind of thing, and it's going to take someone who believes in it to really tell the story.
Once he's done going to the bottom of the ocean, I think he'll have some more time on his hands.
Okay, hope so.
Oh, go ahead.
All right, so I guess that's it. And by the way, the Mars Society is going to have its next convention in the Los Angeles area in October.
Yes.
We're going to put a bulletin out about that as soon as we get the contract signed, which could be very soon. And but in October, Los Angeles, there'll be a lot of interesting talks, debates, everything, and some fun. So I hope people can come.
We'll try and make it out ourselves. That sounds fun.
And how else can people support you?
Well, they can join the Mars Society. I forget the exact dues right now, but they're probably something like 25 for students, 50 for non-students. And in any case, they can, for free, get on our email mailing list and check out our website and figure out what they want to do.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Zubrin.
Thank you. Okay.
This has been great. Really appreciate it.